I have an anterior pelvic tilt, and the one thing that I often hear about treating anterior pelvic tilt and rib flare, ribs popping forward, is to strengthen your core. I guess I'm wondering how to go about core exercises with my narrow infrasternal angle. Oftentimes when I exercise my core, my upper obliques want to do all the work, which squeezes my ribs together and makes my ISA narrower. Do you think that as of right now, I should just stop doing all core exercises to prevent this? Or should I continue to do more the standard type of core exercises like planks and dead bugs? There's a lot to unpack from this question. It's a great question, Bob. The first thing I want to start out with is addressing any potential misconceptions we may have about what's going on with the very common anterior pelvic tilt and orientation, or the rib flares popping forward. We don't necessarily have good evidence to suggest why this is and this occurs, and some of it to some extent is normal. There is a wonderful study done in 1955 by Weisel where they looked at x-rays of the sacrum in various positions, one of them being standing. And guess what, folks? When you're standing, your sacrum is nutated to some degree. When your sacrum is nutated, it's going to be more anterior, the pelvis that is. So if you're standing upright, anterior pelvic tilt is normal. That's one thing. The second thing is the reason why this likely happens, or at least one reason that I don't think we can say that someone may be biased towards being in an anterior tilt and not being able to reverse that, because that's really what the issue is with anterior tilt or rib flare. It's not inherently bad. The problem happens when you have a concomitant loss of movement options, meaning, okay, sure, you're anteriorly pelvic tilting, you're J-Loing like a boss, and if you can't go the other way, if you can't posteriorly tilt and orient the pelvis, if you can't create relative motion at the sacrum or anywhere else, or you can't get that rib cage to come down, not by crunching, but with a full exhale, because that's what's going on most likely, that's when things become problematic. And we want to make sure that you can do that. But the reason why that likely happens is not because of a loss of core strength. The research on core stability stuff, or weak core or lack thereof, is pretty bleak. So it's not that there's this massive epidemic of everyone's got weak cores. You can see this very commonly in people who have phenomenal abdominals, six-pack, or very strong folks. I work with a lot of higher level athletes at Elevate Sports Performance and Healthcare. Link in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/core-training. Definitely check it out. There's going to be a dope blog post that corresponds with it. Links to everything we talk about today. Please give it a shot if you haven't already. But I've worked with a lot of strong athletes in my day, and this prevalence of an anterior pelvic tilt and rib flares is very common. And you can't tell me that these extremely high level, high force producing, fast athletes have a weak core. Like if the core was weak, they would not be able to perform at the high level that they are. So I think that there's just a little misconception about what really is going on. What I think is the more important thing with this, if you're seeing an anterior pelvic tilt and a rib flare and you don't have an ability to reverse it, there's likely a loss of movement options occurring in the ventral cavity. Ventral cavity being thorax, abdomen, and pelvis. And we want to try to do things to reverse that. In fact, consider this. If I have a rib flare and I have an anterior pelvic tilt, you might not be able to produce as much force through the core muscles, the abs, as you would if you were in a different orientation. And the reason why has to be because of the relative leverage or lack thereof that these muscles would have in that position. Because what's going on from a biomechanics standpoint when you see this? If I have ribs that are flaring outward, essentially what's happening is the thorax is migrating into a forward or anterior position, You're getting increased extension through the posterior aspect of the body. And the thing that pushes the ribs forward is the diaphragm's position. If the diaphragm maximally descends and flattens, it starts to have more of an anterior orientation, and that can lead to the ribs doing what they're doing. And that doesn't mean that it's completely descended and there's no dynamic movement. It just may be that there's a loss of dynamic movement because there's reduced excursion into the ability to eccentrically orient the diaphragm. When the diaphragm flattens, folks, what is it pushing on as it flattens or as you take a breath of air in? Because that's when the diaphragm gets pushed downward. Well, folks, it pushes the abdominal contents downward as well. And what may happen as I get this downward pressure of the viscera moving downward is it may be too much for the pelvis to catch, and then subsequently the pelvis will dip forward because of the increased downward movement of the viscera. And so from a biomechanics standpoint, we would want to restore respiratory things to likely make this happen. With that said, in that particular position, if the abdominal contents are being pushed downward and forward, that's going to make the lower abdominals more eccentrically oriented because the viscera is pushing into the ab wall. That's going to put the ab wall in stretch, and that may make it more challenging for the abs to produce force or to concentrically bias themselves. And that doesn't mean that the abs are weak. It's just they aren't biased in a good orientation to move weight or produce a large amount of force. Just like if you were doing bicep curls, which your boy does a lot, if I do curls from a straight arm position, I can't move as much weight as I can if I do from a bent arm position. But we wouldn't say that, well, Zach, the reason why you can't curl as much weight with your arms straight is because your biceps are weak. Did you see these things? No way in hell are my biceps weak. It's because from that orientation, I can't get enough leverage to lift an appreciable amount of weight in comparison to a bent elbow position. That's the difference. I would argue the same thing is likely going on with those phenomenal abdominals of yours, folks. If the diaphragm is descending very far and it's pushing the viscera downward and you don't have an ability to reverse that, that's going to make it much more challenging for you to create an abdominal contraction to push the viscera back upward, hence might not be able to produce adequate force through the core. But now here's the interesting thing that my main man Bob talks about with this particular situation. He mentions, because he's a narrow infrasternal angle, for those of you who don't know what a narrow infrasternal angle is, basically it's just where the angle at the underside of the xiphoid process of your sternum is less than 90 degrees, so it's going to be shaped like this. But with that particular presentation, the way that happens from a biomechanics perspective is as the diaphragm descends and flattens, you have increased negative pressure within the thoracic cavity that causes the rib cage to collapse inward. 1, 2, the line of pull of the diaphragm changes on the lower aspect of the rib cage, and that also contributes to an inward pull, causing the ribs to essentially collapse in. We see the same thing in the upper airway with obstructive sleep apnea. It's the same mechanism, only now we're seeing it in the lower airway. And there's also structural influence as well, but that's the biomechanical influence as to why that narrows. When that happens, the upper abs, and in particular the external obliques and even the rectus damnioculatus abdominis, are going to have a better orientation to elicit contractions in that area, which can potentially narrow the infrasternal angle even further. And this is why Bob, when he does his core training, likely, at least this is my thought, and I've seen this quite a few times, is when he tries to do core exercises the upper obliques do all the work. It's because they are in a better orientation to produce a muscle contraction because of the change of the shape and the attachments of the lower rib cage, the upper part of the abdominals. They have a lot more leverage. So then when you go and do some basic exercise that targets the abs, the upper abs may contract a lot more, which then reinforces this whole loss of movement options. Because when I contract the upper part of the abs, that causes the abdominal contents to displace downward even more, then you have the same issue. A lot of times when this happens, and Bob, I'd be curious if this happens with you, you might see your lower belly start to pooch outward. And that's because of the increased tension in the upper part of the abdomen causing the downward displacement of the guts to push then into the lower ab wall. You'll see this a lot sometimes when you're first teaching an individual to perform some of the tucking that we talk about with the stack. They may have a difficult time being able to perform that posterior pelvic tilt without excessive abdominal contraction, especially of the superficial musculature and the upper abs, and then you'll see a pooching out of the lower belly, which we don't want because that's just reinforcing the issue that we're seeing. So then you might be wondering, okay, does that mean I'm screwed? Should I just cease doing all core training? Should I stop with my chops? Should I stop with my lifts? Should I stop with sit-ups and let my ab training go adrift? I don't think so. I think what you have to do is sweat the technique like my main man Eric B. and Rakim used to say. Some of the greatest rappers of all time. No, actually, Rakim. He's probably well lauded by many. But the key is to reinforce, or to take this presentation and shove it in the exact opposite direction. So if I'm going to be a person who's in an anterior orientation or tilt to the pelvis, well, we got to posteriorly tilt that bad boy. If I'm someone who has abs in the upper aspect of the rib cage that contract like whoa, and the infrasternal angle is narrow AF, I have to do things that create expansion of the lower rib cage. And the way I do that is by going with a full, soft exhalation, making sure I get as much air out as humanly possible. That involves minimally contracting those particular areas of the abdominal wall. Because folks, when you have this particular situation where the diaphragm is maximally ascended, well folks, the only way you're going to be able to restore dynamics in that lower part of the rib cage is to get that diaphragm to ascend. And the way you do that is by exhaling very softly to where you do not get that abdominal contraction in the upper part of the ab wall, which will narrow the ISA further. You want to be able to allow it to maximally ascend, and then once you're in that orientation, taking a nice, silent, easy, effortless breath of air in, which will encourage lateral expansion of the lower rib cage, aka the bucket handle. Folks, if this sounds like the stack, it is. That is what I'm talking about. For me, when it comes to doing any core-based activities, it is a fundamental concept that I have to burn into my supreme clientele's brains. And once we have that, and we've taught them the ability to use a lower intensity strategy, then we can build intensity upon that. Because what Bob is doing is a compensatory strategy that is going to limit his movement options. If your goal is to just get the upper abs to contract as all hell, then maybe this is useful, if we're talking hypertrophy or something like that. But in Bob's case, if he wants to increase the available movement that he has, which if he's mentioning that he's got rib flares and anterior tilt, chances are he can't go in the opposite direction, then we got to keep it on the down low, go slow with it, and focus on stacking capabilities. And I think if he does that, no one's going to mess with him. Ways that I start teaching people with this could be a hook-lying tilt exercise, where you're just focusing step one on making sure you can get a posterior pelvic tilt without abs kicking in overtly or doing a ton of lumbar flexion. It's a good debrief where I outline the difference between those two things. You'll definitely want to do things like that. And then eventually progress on that concept into higher intensity activities, which could be some of your lower level core training, but it could be on the high end, some of your slower speed activities like squats, split squats, things of that nature. And that doesn't mean that when you're doing your max effort back squat that you have to, okay, I'm going to get this tuck. Let me make sure I get a full exhale. Oh no, I felt the lower abs contract a little bit too much. I better set the bar back up. It's not what I'm talking about, folks. We're talking about targeting this to improve movement options. And that's really the key when it comes to minimizing the compensatory strategies that Bob is talking about. To summarize this incredible question, if you got an anterior pelvic tilt and rib flare and you can't reverse it, it's not because you got a weak core. It's you need to teach yourself a different movement behavior than what you're accustomed to, because that's your body's path of least resistance. The solution, stack so you can talk to Zach. Get out posterior pelvic tilt. Get a full exhalation so you're not kicking in those upper abs. And if you do that, whew, you're going to be moving and grooving like none other. Awesome question, Bob.